Great. Well, thanks everyone. I'm super excited about this class. We're excited by the number of participants and the registrations. It's designed as an 8-week course, and of course, we'd love it if you come each time, but each class has also been designed to kind of be self-containing and just you can independently take that class, understand it, cook the recipe from it. This is the only week when we won't have a recipe, but it's because we're going to work on some of the fundamentals, a little bit about ingredients, and some basic cutting techniques and cooking techniques that we will use then throughout the class. Just a little about me. I am a chef and a registered dietitian. I've been working in kitchens since I was 17. I'm 45 now, and I've worked in kitchens in Michigan, where I'm from, in Chicago for 12 years, in the city of London for a couple of years. And I worked in that kind of fine dining end of restaurant kitchens for most of my career. And then when living in Chicago, I got involved in the school system and started working with children, families, and the K through 12 public education system and feeding children through the school system. So I then moved out here to Boulder about 10 years ago. I actually worked for the Boulder Valley School District. I'm guessing many of you have connections to BVSD or children in BVSD. And I was the director of food service for the 2020 to 2023 period during that pandemic period when we did a lot of community feeding and a lot of collaboration with community food share. So super exciting to be back in the fold and working with community food share. And thank you for the opportunity, and to Danone, which is one of the sponsors of the program, or the primary sponsor of this program. So the way it's going to work and kind of the back and forth in the flow is I'll be talking, you'll have the interpretation going if you're taking advantage of that. Every 10 or 15 minutes or so in the cooking process, as we work through ingredients, we'll be doing a lot of work over the cutting board and then some over the stove. Tonight I'll kind of give you a taste of how that's going to feel. But then every 10 or 15 minutes, several times throughout the 1-hour class, we will take a pause. I'll tell Jessica, who's coordinating the filming part, we'll take a stop. We're going to call it Chef's Corner. That's an opportunity for you to ask questions if you have them. You can ask questions into the chat ongoing during the class. And then those will go to Jessica as well. And then she can have the opportunity to bring some of those questions out during that time. So at any point when you have a question, you can enter it in the chat. Or if we stop for the Chef's Corner, you can type that in then. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes. I'll give a brief overview of the class, some of the things we'll be doing. It's meant to also challenge each of us and have us learn some cuisines from other global cultures. So it's a tour around the world through flavor. And what I like to think is each of us is an expert at the food we grew up with, right? So I grew up in the Midwest cooking kind of upper Midwestern food, lots of corn, potatoes, and meat. My mother was English, so I learned a few English recipes from her. Each of you on this call, I'm sure, come from a different background. Your parents come from a different background, your grandparents, and you learn things growing up. You just grow up in the home, you grow up in the kitchen. So I want to first remind you that each of you is an expert in your cuisine and your food, right? So what this class is meant to do is to take you on a tour to understand some of the finer points of global cuisines, including some of the best global cuisines with thousands of years of history and culinary adventure behind them. So that's the overall tenor of the class. So I'm just going to run through the different weeks just to let you know kind of what we're in for. I am trying to recruit at least a couple of guest chefs from the countries that we'll be visiting through food and have them come onto this call as well and join as guest chefs. And that I think is going to add even yet another piece of understanding and opportunity for you to ask questions about that culture and cuisine. So this week, as I mentioned, we're going to work with some ingredients, some basic techniques and recipes. We're going to focus a lot on the onion family, onions and garlic, the allium family we call it. And then we'll do some cooking techniques. Week 2, we'll be visiting Colombia and Venezuela. So quite a lot of overlap between those two cultures and foods, although significant differences as well. I'm hoping to bring my friend Chef Pablo, who is with the Hispanic Restaurant Association and is from Colombia, to bring his element to next week. Week 3, we're going to be going to India. So the subcontinent of India, including kind of the world of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, that whole subcontinent of India. So very flavorful. Spicy, if you'd like it to be. We'll talk a little bit about kind of mild, medium, hot, and Indian hot, as they say. Different levels of spice that you can bring. Week 4, we'll be visiting the cuisine of West Africa. So hopefully my friend Chef Modu can come in from the Gambia, or he can Skype in or video call in with us. We're going to do the cuisine of the Gambia and Senegal. So 2 adjacent countries that have a lot of also overlap with their cuisine. Week 5, we'll be going to Egypt and North Africa. So we'll be cooking some Egyptian street food and a Moroccan dish, so some of the North African countries. Week 6, we'll be moving to the Mediterranean. So some of the types of foods like hummus, baba ganoush, pita breads, some of those dishes that are the hallmarks of areas like Turkey, Greece, kind of throughout the northern Mediterranean region. So in week 7, we'll go to Southeast Asia and Vietnam, make some Vietnamese spring rolls, work with some rice-based ingredients. And finally, in week 8, which we'll let you know more about, more details later in the course, is we're planning to do an in-person event to kind of celebrate the class, celebrate what we've learned, in which each of you can come in a potluck style and cook a cuisine from your world or cuisine that you're familiar and you have some history with. And then we'll do a bit of work on food presentation, plating, and food photography, because who doesn't love to Instagram a few cool photos of what we've made? So we'll talk about some elements of that. So that's kind of the overview. All right, I'm going to start on today's content. So we are talking about the allium family, and we will have a brief nutritional piece each week as well. And this week's on the family that many of you know, and these are very common ingredients in most homes, again, around the planet, which is another thing I love about working with these ingredients. You'll find these in India, you'll find them in China, you'll find them in Mexico, South America, North America. These are some common foundational type ingredients that provide flavor for ingredients around the planet. They're also some of the cheapest ingredients. They're usually found at a very low cost, depending where you are and how you access your food. But it's a foundation of sauces, stews, soups, everything. And in terms of the health benefits, this is one of the areas where traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic cooking, and Western medicine and Western medical research align, which is, bottom line is these things are very good for you. And why is it that they are so good for you? They've been shown through research to help with cancer prevention, an antioxidant to prevent aging of the cells and prevent or reduce the chance of cancer, various cancers. It's been shown to promote better circulation, so cardiovascular disease and heart disease prevention. It's been shown to help with gut health with the prebiotics, which can feed the positive bacteria that we know are very important to growing in the intestine to help you process and derive nutrients from food. So it helps feed the intestinal flora in a positive way. And then there's an ingredient or a component of these ingredients called quercetin, which causes inflammation reduction. And as we all know, inflammation and pain of the joints and the entire body is also really detrimental. And so it causes some inflammation reduction, much in a different channel, but in a way that you might take ibuprofen for, but this can cause an inflammation reduction as well. For those of you with concerns about blood sugar or who are struggling with something like prediabetes, diabetes, or just concerned and interested about blood sugar, they also have a low glycemic index. So meaning that they do not cause a significant spike in your blood sugar, even though there are natural sugars present in the product. Due to all the fiber and the other elements, it doesn't cause a blood sugar spike. So it was considered a good food for someone that's concerned about blood sugar. So that's the nutrition part of this. And now we're going to, I'll move, if you could, Jessica, just move to the board itself as the main. I'm going to keep talking and you should be able to hear me still, I hope. But I'm going to focus on the handwork and some of the different ways and methods that we're going to work with these ingredients. So I'll start with kind of these 3 here, which are all similar but different, right? The red onion, the white onion, and the yellow onion. The yellow onion, sometimes called sweet onion or sweet Vidalia onion, does have slightly more sugar, but they all do contain natural sugars. And the best way you can understand and taste the natural sugars in the onion is if you cook them very slow and low for a long time, what we call caramelized onions, which you may have had in a dip or sauce. And the caramelization is what cooks off a lot of the water and brings out the sweetness. So you'll find with a low slow cooking that you'll find a very sweet flavor can be derived from these. This is a cousin to the onions. That's a shallot. So if you've ever seen a recipe that says shallot, don't stress if you can't find one or if you don't have one at your local store. You could just substitute a red onion. The shallot's a little more delicate of a flavor. It's not quite as pungent like with that intense oniony. So, but we'll talk about ways that we can reduce the pungency in any case. But shallots have, the layers are a little bit thinner and they're a little bit finer. So it can be used as like a garnish. People chop them on like oysters or things that are kind of fancy preparations. They might do chopped shallots instead of a chopped onion, also because of the less pungent taste. I've got these little ones, which are called cipollini onions, or that's the Italian name. Italians use them a lot. They'll just top and tail them and take the peel off and then just drop those right into a stew or a soup, or glaze that with meat and just have like a sweet little pop onion taste. So that's an option. They're a little more finicky, take a little bit more work, but it's a cool kind of different alternative too. Similar flavor to the yellow onion. So, all right. So I've also brought a couple of other more green, fresher type of onion. So these are the green or spring onion, as they're called. And we're going to chop each of these in a different way in a moment. But fresh onions, people often ask, what part should I use? Should I use the dark green, the light green, the white? The answer is all of it. It's really a matter of your preference. If you don't like the look of the dark green, don't use it. But otherwise, you can cut this entire thing and chop it up, and it goes great. The only case you might not want to do that, if you've ever bought sometimes these get slimy and wet. So you're going to want to you can just remove that. Let's say this was a bad piece. You can just peel that away and discard that. So you do want to be watchful for that. So, an even more fine allium member is chives. So I want to just put a quick spotlight on chives here. Very cool product. These are the ones from the grocery store here, just the straight green chives. I'm gonna pull this one out. And then these are actually directly from my garden. So the chives around this time of year do start to flower. That's cool. It doesn't take away from the flavor of the rest of the chive at all. And in fact, what I've done here is just take apart those top chopped chive flowers. And then this could be another really pretty but simple garnish with just a mild onion flavor. So very cool. So this being kind of the most delicate one, I am going to start with these in terms of cutting. So I have already washed and dried these. And one of the big things with fresh herbs is you do want to make sure that they're dry when you cut them. Whether it's cilantro, parsley, any other type of fine green herb, you just want to make sure that it's not wet, or else it's just going to turn to mush on your cutting board. It's just going to be like a mushy mess, right? It's going to be hard to get the nice, pretty pieces of chive that you'd like. So it's up to you. You can either leave them lengthwise like this, or you can fold them over. For efficiency's sake, sometimes we just fold them over. And it also helps you get a little better of a grip on them to keep them a little bit closer to the board. You're just going to use any kind of comfortable knife that you're good with that's sharp, preferably as sharp as possible. And we're just going to pass down the whole set, putting a lot of pressure, but also using very sharp, clear knife strokes. At the end, if you're getting close to cutting yourself, I always say it's not worth it. So I'm going to put these aside. And then you've got a nice little pile of fresh herbs. I'll pick out a couple of the longer ones that mixed in there. But then this should be a nice little, really pretty, but simple way to garnish a dish. You could also mix it in with, let's say, corn, tomatoes, make some sort of salsa with it. This could be like an extra component that just adds a little bit of the onion flavor. So I'm going to cut the spring onions next, and then we're going to take a minute for questions. So spring onions are a little hardier. They're not quite as delicate, but we still want to treat them with some care. I'm just going to take just the top piece off of these and line them up and just take the root end. And again, what part of the spring onion is usable? All of the rest, right? So this entire piece. Again, it's good to kind of get a firm grip, keep them all together if you can. If you don't want to do them all at once, it's surely easier to just do 3 or 4 at a time. I'm just going to pass down this way. Again, the sharper the knife, the better. So nice little circles, little rings. Notice if you're looking at the knife technique, the front edge of my knife is never leaving the board. It's just a rocking motion back and forth. Just lifting it. Okay. So a nice pile of spring onions. Again, certainly could use raw in a preparation like some sort of a summer dish or casserole or like a tossed fresh salad, but also could be cooked or thrown into a stew, just in the same way that shallots or other fresh onions would do. So we've covered a little bit here and talking about some health stuff and a little bit of cutting. So just wanted to pause for any questions, take a minute. Yes, if you could put it back on me there. Thanks. I am crying, by the way. I'm crying already. So get ready for some more tears. Anything from the group yet?
There's no questions on my end, but feel free to use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can just send it in the chat and I'll read it out loud to Chef Steven.
All right, if nothing's popping up, then I'm going to proceed with the next. Back to the board. Okay, so we're going to go to shallots next, because again, it's slightly less common. You may have used them, maybe not.
Oh, actually, we had a quick question come in.
Oh, go ahead. I can answer it while I cut here.
Perfect. So we had the question, what is the best way to dry the herbs after you wash them?
Oh, good question. So I just set them on a paper towel and just kind of use the paper towel to almost pat them a little like this, just to kind of get them mostly dry, and then just let them air dry for a little bit from there. Cool. Thank you for the question. So again, the shallot is just a little bit finer. I'm going to cut it 2 different ways. One is just slicing it, so just slicing it across. This is the preparation I would probably use if I was going to be cooking it into a soup or a stew. It would just give some nice little ringlets. Or if I were to be just frying it up for any kind of purpose where you'd be sauteing it, I might use this. If you're going to use it for more of a garnish, like I mentioned with oysters, for example, it's kind of a classic one. You're just going to want to take, with all these onions, the commonality is that we keep I'm going to just call it the butt end. That's the root end. That's a nicer term. The root end of the vegetable. We want to keep that connected so that we can then cut the rest of the onion without it falling apart. So many times I've seen people chop an onion, the root end isn't connected, and then it just kind of goes apart all over their board and it cuts kind of haphazard. So what we always want to do is keep that end connected. I'm going to cut down in a few small thin strips. And then we'll go across. Again, certainly helps to keep it together. Also, just kind of keep a good grip on it with your other hand. It's a lot finer. This could be for a salad dressing, a marinade, something where a smaller piece, or the garnish. And again, I can tell even the volatility in terms of the onion pungency or the onioniness of this is less. Even as I cut it, I'm not getting that same eye stinging, crying type of feeling. So shallots, I think, are a nice alternative. You could just call them like a fancy onion, you know. And Good just to mix it up too. As you can see, they have a little bit of a reddish hue, but not as intensely red as the red onion itself. I'm gonna move on to the red onion next because I do like to, not everybody loves onions. Not everybody loves the intensity of onions. My wife is one of those people. She had a bad experience eating onions when she was young and just doesn't like that intensity of a raw onion. So this is a technique I'd like to show, very simple. That's a way to reduce the pungency of an onion that you're working with, especially if you're going to use it for something raw, like a salad. I learned this technique in Peru. I was in Lima, Peru for several weeks doing some cooking, and I learned this. They do this for their ceviche. If you've had ceviche, if you like ceviche, they use a lot of onion, but it doesn't have an extreme pungency, and this is how they prepare it. So this would be the Peruvian method, is to go in half with a smallish red onion, flip on its side, and then just cut in very thin strips across, like rainbows, you could call them. See the rainbow shape? This is my preferred way to slice. Again, notice the root end is staying intact, so this onion is not going anywhere, right? It's staying in place. It's allowing me to cut it easily, get nice consistent cuts, little rainbows. This is the step that's, I think, brilliant, but a lot of people don't know, which is just putting it in ice water. So you put these in ice water, two things happen. One is that the actual structure of the onion perks up a little and kind of tightens and crisps up. So even now you can feel like it's very crisp. It breaks nicely. It's got a nice, just quick, right away the texture changes. And then if you leave this onion in there for anywhere from 2 hours to overnight, you could certainly do overnight. That's what they do in Peru. Then when you pull them out, you'll still have all the good parts of the onion flavor, but you won't have that intensity and that raw onion flavor. So that's kind of my red onion tip for the day. So yeah, I mean, really two ways you could do it if you have someone who doesn't like raw onions. One is you could cook them. As I mentioned, the cooking brings out the sweetness. This could be another method that you could try. And this is delicious. If you cut these small dice on these into an onion, and then you just cut these and toss these with any type of other salad, you're gonna see the flavor is there, but not the intensity. So, all right. So I'm gonna move on to actually talking a little bit about some of the instructions that you're going to see in recipes. And even in this class, some of the recipes I've pulled from some of my favorite cookbooks, some I've pulled a couple from the New York Times. I've kind of aggregated some of these recipes, and you're going to see certain instructions that get repeated a lot. So I'm going to pull out some examples of roughly what we're talking about with certain things. I'm using sweet potatoes just as a visual example to show you. So if anyone has ever seen a recipe and you've seen it say small dice, medium dice, or large dice, this is kind of what it means. It doesn't exactly apply to everything because obviously some vegetables are round and unusually shaped, and others are, long and thin like a carrot. So it's a little tricky to get these exact cuts. But this is kind of what it means as a guide. This is a small dice, which they define as, I'm going to use a spoon here to show, that is 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. So why do we like to shoot for small dice, medium dice, or large dice? One is just consistency of cooking so that everything cooks about the same amount. You don't have some overcooked, some under. Two is visually, it just looks cool. I mean, right? It looks cool. It's just, you're basically making a little cube. This next one is medium dice. So the technical definition of medium dice is 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. So I like to think of it as something that would fit nicely on a spoon. Like if you're eating a soup or something, it's the kind of piece you could pick nicely out of a soup. So it's about 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And then the large dice, which would more often be for like roasted root vegetables, maybe like roasted beets, roasted potatoes, roasted sweet potatoes, is 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. And these ones that I've cut here are in no means perfect. But if you come across those terms in a recipe, that's kind of visually what it means. 1/4 inch cubes, 1/2 inch cubes, and 3/4 inch cubes. Small, medium, and large dice. So how does that apply to onions? To bring it back to the onions. If the recipe were to say small dice, medium dice, or large dice, then here's kind of how we could roughly achieve that. So again, this is a white onion. I've got the root end. I tell my kids when cooking with them, or anyone when cooking, is it's always good to turn first a round object into a flat object that doesn't move. So I now have 2 perfect halves, still with the root end attached. I've just taken the peel off. So if I'm talking about a small dice, what I do is just take, this is sort of a round, like almost like a rainbow type approach. I'm going around, just visually looking at it and approximating about a 1/4 inch, right? What's gonna happen is the layers of the onion will fall apart after I cut it, but this is gonna mean more or less that I'm gonna get about a 1/4 inch per piece. So this would be what I would call roughly like a small dice onion. Again, notice my technique, the front of the knife never leaves the board. You're just chopping and moving the knife slowly down the line. When you get to the end, like I did before, you can kind of chop this up if you like, and just get right down to the roots, so you're using all the product, you're not wasting any. And what I end up here, this doesn't look quite as precise and as cool as these, right? Because I took a little more time with these and they weren't a layered vegetable, I could cut them exactly. But that's more or less what it means. If it says cut an onion into small dice, that's more or less what it looks like. Okay. I'll show one more. So if it were to be, I'll just do large dice as an example, then you're roughly looking at 3/4 of an inch pieces, which will only be on this onion, maybe 3 cuts this way, and then you turn it back and roughly do 3/4 inch this way. Again, the layers of the onion make it fall apart, but that's what I would say. If a recipe says large dice onion or large chop, rough chop, that's what I'd call that. So again, recipes are written in all kinds of different ways, and I don't always love the terminology they use, but it's good to know. And the other thing, I mean, if it says rough chop can also mean maybe eventually you're going to puree the soup or the sauce, so it really doesn't matter what size they are. All right, I'm going to take another quick pause for questions before we move on to garlic and ginger.
So we do have another question, and it is, how do you take the skin off the onion?
Oh, cool. Yeah, great. Let's go back to the board then. I'll use the red onion just because it visually stands out a little better. What I do is, again, I use just one knife of about this size for a lot of things, right? You can do a lot of things with a chef knife. So here I would start by just cutting off the minimum that I can of this end. So the non-root end, I'll call it. And then if the root end is really like gnarly, like if there's a lot going on there or there's a bunch of roots coming out, you can kind of trim it like a little, like I'll show you something like that. Like that kind of gets rid of like those hairs, but yet it still stays connected. And then what I do is on the board, I'll just take that same knife and just come down, just get that first layer if I can. If you go a little deeper, it doesn't matter because you can just peel off the first, and then I just peel off this first layer. And then, of course, clearly wipe the board and get rid of all this stuff, because what you don't want and what you least want is that this in your food, the skin. So get rid of this, and that's it. That's kind of the simplest way that I know. You could use, if you're more comfortable with a smaller knife, you could pull out a smaller knife to do this part. But I do it almost like you might have an avocado. You're just kind of going down like this and just peeling one layer. Which begs a funny story too. Thanks for asking the question. I used to work at a restaurant in Chicago, and my chef, Jennifer Newberry, said I remember I looked up at her because I was peeling, 10 or 12 onions like this and chopping them. And she said, or I said, Jennifer, how many layers should I peel off with this onion? Like just this one or the next one? Or she said, if you have enough time to think about that, then you're not working hard enough. Get back to work. So, the one thing I'll say is that if you do discover, I'm sure each of you has seen this, but there can be layers inside the onion that are greenish, or you might even find a perfectly fine onion, but just this one of the layers, for whatever reason, has rot, right? So in that case, I just split out the inside, split out the other, and discard that layer. But it happens pretty frequently because onions are really kind of perishable, more than people think. So, okay. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to move on to garlic and ginger. So, two of our other favorite ingredients, most of us on the planet. So garlic and ginger, a little more finicky, a little more handwork might need to be done with these. You can certainly buy garlic cloves that are already peeled and ready, and those might be good if you're using a lot of garlic, like let's say cooking a big pot of roasted garlic or using a large amount. But for most purposes, this is the best way to go. It's just a firm, fresh, nice white garlic head. So that's what they call a head of garlic. And then I'm going to show just kind of the most simple way I know to break it down, which is just pressing on it with the palm of your hand. Open it up. You should hear that nice like crunch, and everything should just fall apart. So now you have, of course, the skin that you don't want, right, which we're going to discard. A way to get the skin off of each individual clove is just run them through your hands like this. See, the cloves are popping out. So we now are just getting these, which are the individual cloves, which is what we want, right? So I'm just gonna set those aside. I'll get rid of my scrap. And another thing where I think recipes are often not that great in terms of how they describe things is it'll say a clove of garlic, but obviously that clove is way different size than this clove, right? This clove probably has 4 times as much garlic. So you just kind of have to use some common sense there and go by how much you like garlic, because some people don't like the extreme pungency and flavor of garlic. Some people just simply can't get enough and they want to like sweat it through their pores. So we're all different in that way. But again, I'd say most people like at least some garlic. I've met very few people who are averse to it or who don't like its flavor, especially once you like roast it or caramelize it or give it some sweetness. So, okay, so then I think this is a great thing for kids to help with. I have a 13, 15-year-old myself, so I sometimes need to throw them a job. So I think with these, you can, again, 2 methods. You could either use your hand, again, like this, and just smash it. Don't worry if it breaks the whole clove, but look how nicely and neatly that came out. You could also use a pan, like a little metal pan or something, and just hit them or smash them like this. But that's really what you want, is just end up with those. So like I'll go through all the big ones and just pop these. And then another question people ask with garlic is just kind of a fundamental, is like, do you or can you use the hard little root end right there, the part that was connected to the root? You can. It's not going to kill anybody, but it's not pleasant, right? If you came across that, in a dish and you just ate that piece, you'd be a little chewy. It wouldn't be good. So I would say it's nice, certainly if you have time, to just cut out that root end. And then the primary ways that garlic is prepared, or at least cut, would be sliced. So, which I call like the Godfather style. If anyone's seen the Godfather, where they slice the garlic with the razor blade. So that would just be where you're just slicing it like this into thin slices, or garlic chips. If anyone likes like garlic chips, that's kind of what those are based on. You could fry those up and just have like really nice little roasted garlic chips. But much more common is going to be minced, where really you're just going through and you're just chopping the heck out of the products. Like you're using it, you're shepherding it, you're just chopping until you get very, very small. The danger with many. Yep,
Steven, we have another question.
Go ahead.
So what do you look for when picking out a good head of garlic at the grocery?
Oh, great question. I love that. So this one, even today when I went and picked it out, I'm literally feeling around and I'm pushing on each exterior clove. And if you've ever had one, it's really, you'll know, because sometimes they get a greenish mold and you'll press on it and it'll like poof. And there'll be like a greenish mold that almost comes into the air. So you don't want any softness. You want it very firm. So that's the primary. Thanks for all the questions, by the way. Keep them coming. So the danger, if you miss too finely, and if you're doing a preparation with high oil or high heat, it's incredibly easy to burn garlic, right? I will put my hand up and say I've burned garlic many times. So when you get more to this very small mince type of state, you got to be, of course, very careful as you add that to the oil, especially if it's the first ingredient, that you're not burning that garlic. Again, surprisingly, it has a lot of sugar in it. People don't think of sweetness necessarily, but there's a lot of sugar, and that's what's burning so quickly. So, all right, so that's garlic. One of my favorite ingredients, personally. And again, something I grew up with, and one of the best aromas I can think of is just putting a bunch of garlic cloves in a small pot with some olive oil and making roasted garlic. It's an ingredient you can use for many things, and it's also just like a delicious aroma that'll fill your house. So, okay, we're going to cut some ginger and talk about ginger, which is the only thing we're going to talk about today that's not a member of the allium family, and go with this. So this is slightly, I would say, less common, but it's used, again, throughout Asia, India, the Caribbean, but I think not quite as commonplace in most American kitchens. So they call this a hand of ginger for a reason, right? It fits nicely in your hand, and it usually has protuberances, almost finger-like, that grow because this is a root that grows under the ground. You don't need to wash ginger. There's really no need to wash. In fact, washing it would just get little accumulations of moisture that could rot it if you store it. It's generally best stored not in the refrigerator, out, much like garlic. Garlic and ginger are best stored. And onions, typically at room temperature. So many different ways to cut ginger. If you see recipes, it'll probably say one small piece. Sometimes it says 1 2-inch piece, 1 3-inch piece. So that's what it means, is just one section. Again, varies quite a bit between some of the thinner fingers and some of the archers, but it's like this. So I'm going to show you kind of one of the most precise ways that you can cut it if you'd like to try. There's different ways to peel garlic. I'm going to show 2 of those. So one is with a typical peeler, like a standard, in your drawer type of peeler. And you can peel it like this. But the challenge, as you can see, is that you're kind of getting in and out of a lot of grooves. There's these little knobs. It's a little tricky, right? You could break off the knobs if you don't want it, just to make that easier. And what I like to do is save all of this ginger, the scraps, and make a ginger tea. Very curative, very restorative. Make a ginger tea with these scraps and then add honey, and delicious, right? Or even an iced ginger tea in the summer, since it's probably not the day for a hot drink. So you can use the peeler. Again, this is one option. And I'll finish this up with the peeler. Then the other option is to just use the side of a small teaspoon or spoon. And weirdly, it kind of has the ability to actually take off the peel, but without quite taking as much like scrap as you see here, because it's not digging into and really peeling the vegetable or peeling the root. So there's one piece. That's what I would call like a 3-inch piece of ginger, roughly. The spoon piece, just to show you, and again, you can try both at home, see which one works for you, but the spoon, you're just pulling it towards you, you're just putting a little pressure down, just enough to get the peel. And interestingly, for me at least, you can kind of follow the nuances of the root a little better, and sometimes end up with less waste and actually less risk of cutting yourself too. You know, people cut themselves more often on peelers and cans than knives in the kitchen is that's been my experience. So this can help too. This would be a great kid job too. Try and get all the brown off the ginger with a spoon, right? So, and the fragrance. For me, again, ginger, one of my favorite ingredients. I will say that some people do not like ginger. They have a distaste for it. Piece. To some people, interestingly, a certain small percentage of people that I've met and worked with, to them it tastes a little bit too caustic, almost like soap, a little antiseptic, almost like putting soap in their mouth. So for certain people, just be aware if you're cooking for a crowd, some people don't love ginger. And especially the way we're going to cut it is to cut it into very small pieces so that if it is mixed into a dish, that it isn't as apparent or you're not going to bite into a big chunk. Right? So that can be kind of intense. All right, so I'll just show a method of cutting. I like this one for cutting better than this one. It's just easier. It's going to be easier because it's more kind of square, rectangular shaped. So with this, I'm just going to cut strips, pretty small. It's very fibrous, right? It's got a lot of thick, tough fibers going through there. And that's the other reason we want to break it down. So if you can see this well, these are sort of like pages of the book. And then I'm going to cut each of these into a matchstick, roughly a matchstick. Think like the width and shape of a matchstick. So this would be the part 2, right? And then here, I'll leave these on the board. And then for part 3, which is kind of the end game, we're going to cut them in matchsticks. And then turn them acrossways, 90 degrees. And we're going to reduce it like this. Very small, right? Little tiny. Much like mincing the garlic. This is just a better technique because if you just start to roughly chop the ginger, it's so fibrous that it's hard to get to this state. So I suggest this method. So hopefully you can see that nicely. 3 different levels, right? You're going this way, across, and then finally breaking it down into minced small pieces. And this, you could even cut this further, but I'm good with this. But you could keep chopping it for a stir fry or some application like that if you wanted to kind of have it mix in even more evenly. So there's not as much of a risk of burning ginger. You can certainly burn it, but it's not as quick and as intense to turn as like a garlic. So I'm going to move this setup to the stove just for a couple cooking techniques that we're going to go through. And look, this proves that I'm really cooking in my home kitchen. I'm not in like a fancy kitchen here, folks. This is my home kitchen. So you can do this all at home. Any questions popping up, Jessica?
Nothing coming in yet.
Okay, cool. All right, well, I'm going to talk through a few different basic cooking techniques. I'm going to show you my stovetop here and just, we might be using some.
We have a question.
Go for it.
Sorry. So somebody said, I just have to say this is so awesome. I can't believe how I've mangled cutting onions and ginger.
Great, thanks. Well, and what do they say? Practice makes perfect. So you may not get it exactly the first time, but if that's helpful to you, that's great. That's what we're here for. All right, so I'm going to move on. So some of this is just going to be terminology, and this is just setting the platform for some of the things we'll do in the rest of the class. So 3 things related to water. So 3 methods of water-based cooking that we might use or talk about. One is just boil, right? I've got this water on to boil. And this would be your most familiar method for cooking pasta. Here, I'm going to add some of my sweet potatoes just to get them to the boil. So probably most of you have heard or seen the term simmer. So if we want to say simmer, I'm not going to be able to put it quite to a simmer here, but a simmer visually, what it means is just to see small bubbles erupting around the edge of the pan, around the edge of the water, right? So what that does is it's going to maintain the integrity of the ingredients. The simmer, if you can keep it at a low simmer, this won't break down as much. It'll just kind of gently cook from outside in. We may sometimes use a term called blanch. So the only difference between blanch and boil is in the case of a boil, we would boil the product, we'd cook it right when it's the temperature or the look and the consistency we want. We would throw it into ice water or into an ice water bath to stop the cooking, right? So my example with that, which I did earlier today, would be something like broccoli. As any of you know who overcooked broccoli, either on purpose or by accident, doesn't come out great. And sometimes we all accidentally overcook things, but it's so delicate that when it gets overcooked, it turns kind of gray and mushy. I told you I grew up with an English mother and that's how we ate broccoli. But I discovered that you can, by throwing this in ice water or blanching it, then it stops the cooking, preserves the color, and keeps it really nice. So especially nice with green vegetables. The other thing we may on occasion do in class is steaming. So this is kind of the most low-tech way to steam. I'm just going to put this in. This would normally just be water underneath. You would put in a well-fitting colander or strainer and then put a lid. There's other types of steamers. There's actual equipment that's called steamers, but this is kind of the low-tech way to do that. If we were going to be steaming something, is adding it to this and just putting a lid, letting it steam. And that also can help preserve the integrity of the product and just cook it just how you want it instead of overcooking in water. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to the difference between shallow fry and deep fry. So I'm just going to do what's called shallow fry a piece of tofu. Shallow fry is what I would call a lot of times in a recipe if it says just add enough oil to cover the bottom of the pan. That's what in my world is shallow fry. So in this case, for example, I'll just use vegetable oil. And I'm just going to add enough oil to cover the bottom of the pan as it heats. If your house is anything like mine with an uneven foundation, you'll find that the oil will still pool on one side of the pan, but you work with that. But essentially this would be a classic shallow fry or just enough oil to cover the bottom. I'm just going to visually use a piece of tofu, which is another ingredient that we'll be using later in the class. So shallow fry, you should know that you're in good shape when it starts to bubble and make noise right as you add it to the pan. Of course, you have to be careful when adding these items to the pan. What I suggest is always, if it's something like a piece of meat or tofu or fish, you drop the end that's closest to you in first and then drop that away from you with a movement like that so that the oil doesn't spit back at you, right? So deep frying would just be essentially this, but with the oil up to a higher level or up to a higher level in this pan to where the item is fully submerged in oil. We're not going to be doing deep frying in this class. Most of us eat too much deep fried food, so we're going to be keeping this on the healthier bent. So and then roasting. Roasting is where it implies that we would just be doing it in an air-based environment, not using oil or water as a medium. But we would just be setting our oven for anywhere from 325 to 400, tossing the item perhaps in a little oil, salt, and pepper, and then putting it in the oven, but allowing the air to circulate and bake the product. So those are just some basic terminology stuff that we're going to be doing. I do always encourage you to, if you have questions, if you don't have the piece of equipment that I'm using, or if you don't have the exact equipment, that we can always find a substitute, or there's always usually some way around it. Much like if there's ever an ingredient issue and you don't have an ingredient that you need for one of our recipes or for just another recipe you're making, there's usually a way around it or a substitution we have. All right, I'm gonna leave that. And I also want to emphasize that you can prepare in any of these methods on either a gas, electric, or induction stove. There's no particular requirement that's needed. You don't need a certain kind of stove to do any of the stuff that we're going to be doing. Again, everything that we put in our ingredient list throughout the class is stuff you can either obtain through Community Food Share or at King Soopers. So that's really kind of the intent of the class too, is that it's accessible and that the ingredients are readily available. So, all right, I'm going to open it up to any last questions on what we talked about today, and any questions related to upcoming classes or anything at all?
Yes, so we have a few questions. So first one, will you be talking about knives / sharpening?
So, I don't have any one prescriptive way I would say to sharpen a knife. I would say I sharpen mine at home. I just use a steel, really, which doesn't really sharpen the knife, it more just straightens the edge. I do take my knives in to get sharpened. There's a place called Johnson Sharpening, I think in East County. Sometimes at farmers market, a sharpener will pop up. I know there's one at the Boulder Farmers Market on Saturdays if you're interested in getting a professional sharpening. I do also think those other types you have at home are fine. Usually that there's a kind that has two wheels or stones and you can kind of pull it through. But then I would suggest having a steel, what's called a steel, to also sharpen like this. It takes a little bit of time, but what that does, it doesn't actually sharpen the knife. It just straightens out all the little imperfections in the blade and evens it out. So you kind of need to, if your knives are like in terrible shape, you could also buy a new knife. That's the other thing I say, right? If you have a set of knives where you're always disappointed and you're like, these knives are terrible, you could perhaps purchase one knife that maybe could replace 3 of those bad ones, maybe. Or, it's up to you.
And then another question is, what about stick versus non-stick? And I'm assuming that's pan.
Yeah, there is a world of options out there. There are everything from cast iron pans, which are used in restaurants a lot, which get a natural coating from consistent continual use, and they get that natural coating, which is basically non-stick. There's also non-stick pans. I keep a non-stick like egg pan for eggs, right? Because I think there's special value in not having to scrub out an egg pan. So I try to keep one nice that's just for eggs. So I keep one non-stick. I think, again, it's a matter of preference. I think there's a lot of options out there. There's green coatings. There's these new eco coatings. I haven't tried any of those. I think maintaining your pans is most important. And if you do find a non-stick pan, don't use metal implements in it, because it's those little micro scrapes and cuts that are gonna then just blow up and make it no longer a non-stick pan. Because even my egg pan, every year I buy a new non-stick egg pan because it just gets worn and that coating kind of wears away and it's no longer non-stick. So
we have another question. Can you freeze ginger to save time in later dishes, or will it change the taste?
You can freeze it, absolutely. It will not change the taste. It will change the texture slightly. Like most things that freeze, the freezing causes the fibers and the texture to kind of mush. It gets a little mushy, but I certainly haven't noticed any challenge with, especially if you're cutting it very small and fine, like the way we did it. I would say my suggestion would be cut it first, so chop it finely first, or put it in a food processor. I didn't mention that. Food processor also does a great job of whizzing a bunch of ginger if you're trying to do a lot of it. You can reduce to a very thin, fine mince as well, and then throw that in a bag and put it in your freezer, and it'll keep fine. You can throw that in a stir fry sauce, and you will not notice it. If you try and freeze the whole, let's say the whole hand, and then you try and pull this out of the freezer and cut it, it's going to be mushy and wet and hard to cut. No, so. Yep, and one quick plug for next week's class. Thanks to everyone who came. This was totally fun. I hope you learned something or took something away from today's demo. Next week, I think really do encourage you to come. It should be really fun. We're cooking arepas. Just for preview, we're cooking arepas de reina, which is like a arepas Venezuelan style with smashed avocado and cooked shredded chicken, or vegetarian version without the chicken. We're cooking a very flavorful like rice and beans recipe from Venezuela, Colombia, and we're doing plantains 3 ways. So the green plantain, the yellow plantain, and the sweet plantain. And my friend Chef Pablo has confirmed he should be there, and he's just like a wealth of knowledge, excellent person. His family owns a water buffalo farm in Colombia that makes buffalo mozzarella. He's got food stories for days, so I encourage you to come. So.
Thank you all so much for spending some of your evening time with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you'll tune in for the future classes. We're really, really excited for this series.